Hi there, thanks for joining this session on student lab planning targeted for grades 4 through 8. I'm Francis Vigent from NOADM. This is a session that is picking up where the workshop number 2 on Socratic dialogue left off. So we'll focus today only on student lab planning. There's also future workshops which involve managing the hands-on investigations and structuring debriefs as well as conclusion generation. Student planning falls between Socratic dialogue and the student investigation. The reason for this is that student planning is where students make choices, and those choices form a plan that they use to make things or to experiment with hands-on materials. If students are not engaged in planning, then the unfortunate side is that the learning is going to be greatly diminished. And you'll see things where kids may think they've done something before. You can kind of imagine it as, I've seen a similar material, I must be doing the same sort of thing. We don't want that to happen. But more importantly, we want to engage students in deeper learning. So today's agenda is covering some basic things: why students plan their investigations, the stages for using checkpoints for student planning, because checkpoints are really key in creating accountability and understanding between both teachers and students. Also, how to release responsibility in stages. I'm also sharing with you some video clips, which I'll provide in links for structuring feedback with your teams or with your class. So why students plan their investigations is very basic, but extremely important. By inviting students to create their own solution to a problem or to answer a question, we're creating an important opportunity for deeper learning. We're creating space for students to create something personally meaningful, to develop an understanding, and to also orient themselves to how what they're learning about is personally meaningful and where they have a place in the world with these ideas. And I always love this image because what you see here is a child playing, digging, and using their imagination. Because they have the opportunity to engage in a context, they're also looking at the things around them and making decisions about how they'll use them and what they represent. And so while you may see a toy car or just a toy, a child digging a hole sees a truck that carries dirt and engages their imagination in actually using that in that way. And so you can imagine that as students are planning their investigations, they're having to use imagination, but they're also using skills and knowledge, and they're taking chances, which are extremely powerful, to see if the things that they think will happen actually will happen. And so that's how student planning really is at the intersection of mastery, identity, and creativity. Removing student lab planning or doing the plans for students or copying something and handing it to them removes all of these opportunities. And that's the important thing to recognize, is that they're opportunities. So if we're going to create an opportunity for students to plan, how do we do that and create accountability? And so the way that we do that is with checkpoints. Checkpoints are just these brief interactions with individual students or small teams that help me as the teacher understand what my students or student is thinking. It's also a formative assessment tool because not only am I understanding something better about the students and their thinking, but it also is something that helps the students to uncover and improve their own understanding of what they think they've said or what they thought that they might do along the way. Not that I'm telling them what to do, but it's that reflective engagement that's happening that can lead to some really powerful changes in thinking. Checkpoints have sort of 4 stages of maturity. And the first stage is one that you can do as a whole group. So if you see yourself as sort of a facilitator in front of the classroom, at stage 1, you can be sourcing ideas from students for each part of the lab plan. And I'll share with you some tips and techniques on that. But the whole purpose of stage 1 is to get students understanding the elements of checkpoints. That's, thinking about something, creating something, and then, sharing that and getting other people's input on it, and sometimes being asked follow-up questions on it. That gets students used to this sort of back and forth. The second stage is, once students understand that back and forth, is to actually engage with a partner and to actually try to create a plan, segment by segment, with these checkpoints occurring in between segments, so that they are engaging in a kind of formative assessment. Okay, so they're no longer a member of a large group working on one plan. They're now a member of a small team, a team of 2 students working on a plan, and then you'll have a lot of teams creating these plans. The third stage is that students begin to see these checkpoints as useful for being able to move faster in class, useful for being able to get to those hands-on materials and create the sort of things that they want to create, and useful for actually learning something, getting information that helps to make changes that are meaningful. And finally, the fourth stage is where students and teachers are actually in the flow of performance, where students understand their role, they're using these checkpoints as tools, they are learning from them, and as a teacher, it's a very quick touch point, but at the same time, and when I say very quick, I mean 1 minute, 2 minutes, so not instant, actually giving useful feedback. But it becomes really a tool for understanding how the class is progressing and actually managing the time and depth of thought that's going into these different stages of a lesson plan, not a lesson plan, but a lab plan. So in stage 1, using checkpoints to release responsibility, you might think about starting your year in August or in September, using checkpoints for whole group thinking. So this is not at this point a checkpoint where you've got 2 students coming up to you and talking about what they've created and you're asking, questions of those 2 students. Instead, it's you acting as a facilitator, talking, presenting the scenario or the situation, and getting some brainstorming going around that question, and then actually, as a whole group, beginning to develop out research, hypothesis, summary of experiment, and so on. And at each of those stages, modeling that personal reflection for students, helping them to depersonalize the kind of feedback that they're getting. Because as kids are offering their ideas, other kids are going to agree or disagree. So it's almost like a Socratic dialogue, but you might be asking probing questions as well. And so when you think about that, for students to come to you, basically 2 kids to a teacher at a checkpoint right away can be a little intimidating. And so at these upper grade levels, you might find students who feel like they aren't confident or don't understand something. And so they just don't come up and they just burn through all the time. And, that's because they kind of are worried about the feedback. They're already taking it personally, even though they haven't received any feedback. In other cases, you can have students come up at a checkpoint in teams and you have this discussion, and then as you're sort of offering some suggestions or feedback, they go, oh, like, I can't do this, I don't know how. And the thing is that that's again a situation of a student taking something personally. So when you start your year, if you think about checkpointing the thinking, not so much the team, but working whole group, you can get a lot of these things normalized and part of the classroom culture for how we generate plans right away. And it'll become it won't be a big deal at all when it comes to those small teams coming to checkpoints later on. And that's what I mean by students understanding how to engage in formative discussion, because it's not just this back and forth, but it's really a dialogue. It's not the teacher saying, oh, I like what you have here, you're good, or it's okay, because that feedback's not useful. It's actually the teacher letting the student tell them what they did and then asking questions to understand what the student's thinking was, and then maybe asking a question to probe that further. That's a formative discussion, okay? And the students may have questions too. The places where you would want to checkpoint, at the very beginning of the year in stage one, I would start with the scenario or the situation and that problem or question, and then I would engage students in, using this anchor chart that everybody has, and I would just go right down as if we're using scientific process because it's a question and we're in scientist mode. I would go right into research and ask, what facts do we have or connections have we made that are relevant to understanding how this question is going to get answered, and source those from the group and get them to group them and discuss them. And I'll show you a thinking routine for that. Once you've had that kind of, 5 minutes of discussion, settle on what the research is, that 3 or 5 facts, and then move on to hypothesis and do the same thing. Once you move beyond that stage one, if you're doing a whole group, where I've put these stars, this is where you're going to see those green boxes in your unit talking about checkpoints. Typically question, research, hypothesis, and then you'd have teams check in with you. And you want them to do that when they're ready. So you need that release of responsibility. It's not, you give them question, research, and hypothesis and have them check in with you. That doesn't make any sense, right? So the reason that you have checkpoints at question, research, hypothesis, after those 3 steps, you have one, is that kids can get through that pretty quickly. But summary of experiments is pretty heavy. So you don't want to give them summary of experiment, materials, and procedure, and then checkpoint, because they'll have done a lot of work and invested a lot of time. And the materials and procedure may be based on a summary of experiment that doesn't make any sense or isn't clear enough. So that's why these checkpoints are important to have where we have put them. You can always do more checkpoints, but I wouldn't do too much less than this, or it can become difficult to manage, and you'll end up with, in stage 2, if you're doing that, you'll end up with big lines of kids. So how do you introduce the idea of a whole group checkpoint at stage 1? What I would do is I would introduce a thinking routine. I would use generate, sort, connect thinking routine. And the way that works is it gets students making choices. It gets them seeing that they have power to create things and to share them, and to share things that are meaningful, and that connecting with other people's thinking. It helps them to evaluate other options that they didn't think about, because they're going to hear and see what other kids have come up with. And that generate, sort, connect routine, if it's used, let's say whole group, as a way of generating research and then hypotheses and so on, what can happen is that it can be a way of having the whole groups sort of synthesize and choose what goes, at that point in the plan. Okay. So the way this works is you start like with sticky notes, or you could give the students index cards and have them generate, for example, a fact that they feel is relevant to answering this question. Okay. So you collect your 30 facts, and then what you would do is you could read them off and get the students to help you sort those into groups. Okay, so some kids are going to think of the same facts, or they're going to think of facts that are closely related. Okay, so they may say those belong in the same group, and then you can ask them, well, what would we call that group? Okay, so that group, all of the things that were thought on these 5 sticky notes, the kids may say that that is, you know, light transforms into heat energy, might be what they call that group. Okay, another group might be called the, light is energy group. Another one might be forms of energy, might be a group. So you can imagine like those groups could have lots of different facts that students have given, but it's a way of like synthesizing and coming to consensus around, what's been shared. The next stage is called connect, where you take those groups that have been made, and or you don't as a teacher, but you can facilitate it, is you ask the students, well, how are these groups connected? Can anyone see a connection between 2 or more of these groups, and get them to share those connections? And then you can document them by just drawing a line and putting the word or phrase in there. So this is a way, if you're familiar with the concept maps that are in KnowAtom, this is a way of generating a concept map, but also using it to help students plan and to come to consensus around what's at a particular stage in a plan. And you can imagine that during sort and connect, and even generate, if a student wrote something down, you didn't understand what it was, you can ask questions at each of these stages. Can you tell me more about that? Or what do you mean by, growing? What do you mean by that in this situation? So what that does is by asking questions to get students to elaborate, the students are given the opportunity to explain themselves and make their thinking more visible, but also you are showing interest in their ideas and value, but the rest of your class is also getting to learn more about what somebody else thought. And it builds their confidence and their understanding of the way that we interact when we have a discussion and feedback is given. Okay, so that's what you're laying the foundation for here. And this is an example of what one of those would look like. Okay, this is from a kindergarten class, 1st grade class. And you can see those kids can barely spell and write. They made little sketches. They offered those to their teacher to generate ideas about, maybe traveling or something like that. And then they had to group their ideas, and then they looked for connections between them. Okay, so this can be done on chart paper. It can be done on the whiteboard. One thing I would say, though, is that documenting the thinking this way is really powerful. And if you save it, it gives you an opportunity to rework and reanalyze later when you've gotten to the end of the lab. You can always come back and you can look at a particular point and say, gee, when we were creating our procedure, or when we were coming up with the summary of the experiment, is there anything we would add to that now? Is there anything we missed? And so what that does is that communicates to students that, hey, that thing we did at the beginning, not only did we use it to make a plan, but it's actually something we can go back and think more about later because it still has value. And I can actually see how my thinking's changed. This is huge, okay? At this point, I'd encourage you to pause this video and to check out the 2 Generate, Sort, Connect links that I've shared with you. One is from a kindergarten class where the facilitation is done quite well, where the teacher is not getting in the way of the students, but she is probing and asking questions and soliciting their input and their thinking. There is another video that I'm sharing with you of more of a 3rd, 4th grade class where a Generate, Sort, Connect activity goes on, but I hope that you'll notice, and I'd like you to look for, how the teacher is micromanaging and getting in the way of the students' thinking, particularly during the generate phase, okay? I want you to take a really close look at that because the goal of Generate, Sort, Connect and facilitating it is not to tell students what they should be writing down. If that's what you're doing, that's inappropriate. You need to give up some control there. It's okay to tell them, don't forget to don't forget to write that down. Don't forget to write it down. That's fine. But don't cherry pick their ideas and then tell them to write them down. Okay, that's the point I want you to look for in there. Okay, the first video with the kindergarten teacher does not do that, and that's a really important difference. Now, what you could be doing at the stage 1 is that at each phase where you're doing a Generate, Sort, Connect, you can also use the Science Experiment Planning Guide that's available under the Supporting Resources section when you log into your KnowAtom Interactive. So click your grade, you go to the bottom of the screen, you'll see Supporting Resources in this yellow panel, and you'll see Support for Lab Planning. At the end of that packet, you'll notice that there is a Science Experiment Planning Guide. There's also one for engineering. So imagine as a group, you come to a consensus about research, and then students can capture that here. It's also great because at some point, once students understand a routine like Generate, Sort, Connect, you've done it whole group, you can now let them go with a partner and do it in a small group and share their thinking and what they came to with the whole group. And maybe they retain what they did in their smaller group on their planning guide. And this is a scaffold to using the lab notebooks, okay? So again, this could be, something that you're using in those first 3 or 4 experiments of the year, okay? And you'll see here, this is that Supporting Resources section. So support for student lab planning is where you'll find this planning guide. Now at stage 2, once students have sort of gotten comfortable with what the discussion and the challenging and the contributing and reflecting and all of those things that are involved with checkpoints, once they've gotten comfortable with that as a whole group, now that's the time as a teacher to break students into teams. And when I say time, it's not within the same class, but time in terms of an appropriate unit or lesson to not go whole group and to instead have teams creating their plans and coming through team checkpoints with the teacher. And so at a team checkpoint, as a teacher, I'd be there, I'd grab a student's lab notebook, I'd be looking on while the other student is reading what they have, and I would be asking questions to try to understand what they are telling me. And in some of those questions, I may be probing to find out if this is really a hypothesis or if this is really a fact relevant to the question. And if once I understand what they're saying, I have caught their meaning, I might toss it back and say, well, but, can a hypothesis be a question? Can it end in a question mark? And they might be confused and say, well, actually, I don't know. And then I can let them know, actually, it can't. And I can ask them, do you remember, or what's the relationship between a hypothesis and a question? And they may then remember or in some way recall that hypothesis is supposed to answer the question. And if they don't know that or realize it, then that's an opportunity for me to differentiate and to just fill in the blank and say, the hypothesis has to answer the question. So what I need you to do is I need you to go back and revisit this hypothesis and change it into what you think is the answer to the question that you're trying to answer. And so that's, part of this tossing back is asking questions to get more information and to really probe. And if you hit a wall, you can differentiate, you can give suggestions, and then give the student team a U-turn to go back and make changes and come back and see you. And always communicate with them the amount of time that they have available to do that. Okay, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, something like that. Okay. Now, the way that you might want to structure feedback at these sessions, these check-ins, is using something called the ladder of feedback. And I have provided a link, so you may want to pause this video now and watch the ladder of feedback video. But the ladder of feedback is important because what it does is it helps students to understand what to expect when they check in with you. You're going to ask clarifying questions. You're going to let them know what you value about what they created, and you're going to voice questions or concerns about what they've created if you have them, and you might even make some suggestions. And if you have questions and concerns and suggestions, they're probably going to get a U-turn where they have to go back and rework what they've created to remove, whatever expectations weren't met. Now, just because you have a suggestion or a concern doesn't necessarily mean that students have to make changes. And some of the kind of concerns you might have just might be in the back of your mind, like, I don't think this is going to work, but you don't really know. That's fine. Let them do it. The goal is not to get everybody making things that work, or testing things and finding out that their hypothesis is true. That's not the goal, and that shouldn't be the goal of your feedback. The goal of your feedback is to make sure that they understand if they are creating a hypothesis, that one, they're demonstrating an understanding of the hypothesis that they've created, number one. Number two, they understand what a hypothesis is and its purpose. So, if the students really don't understand what they wrote, then that's a question or concern where you may have a suggestion and you turn them, because there's no point in students doing anything further unless they really understand what they think to be the answer to the question, like why they chose that, for example. All right. Now, when you've watched this ladder of feedback video, what I hope you've seen is a teacher who is using the ladder of feedback, communicating sort of back and forth with the student. But there's also a very other interesting dynamic, is that you can also invite other students into the conversation. So this could get used in a couple of ways. One, if I was going to transition to the stage 2 for the first time, once I had a couple of kids come up, a couple of groups, I might stop the class and say, I'd like you to know exactly how this ladder of feedback works that I'm using. And so, and I've shared with you about the ladder of feedback that I'm going to be using. I just want to model for you what a checkpoint is like. And so, you engage those students as a model, just like you see in the video, and go through the ladder of feedback in 2 minutes with them. And you can even invite other students in the class to chime in if you'd like. And that way everybody understands that this is an open process where, when I go up with my partner to talk to my teacher and show them that I'm actually, I'm valued, I'm being asked thoughtful questions, and this can be valuable. Okay, it demystifies, it makes it less scary, so you don't have kids going to the bathroom to avoid you. Okay. And so if you haven't had a chance to look at that video, definitely look at it now. The next thing that I would mention is that the lab notebooks should be messy like this, okay? Whether you have the straight lined or it's graph paper or whatever, students should be making changes because their thinking should be evolving as they go through checkpoints. So if students were creating their own question related to the scenario, knowing what materials we have available, they may come up and have a question that they want, it's just not quite clear. So they have to go back and refine it. So there's something's going to be crossed out and you're going to see what's refined there. Once they come back and they pass that checkpoint, they go on to research. Well, in the research, they may be saying things that aren't relevant because they can't tell you why they're relevant. So they have to go back and make changes and pick things that are relevant. Or maybe they misunderstood the fact, and so they made some changes for that reason. So seeing changes is a very normal part of lab planning. And it actually is one of the ways we know that they're authentic. When there's no changes, typically that's something a teacher gave a student and the students really don't understand them. And so the learning doesn't happen. And that's the key here, is that this is a process where lots and lots of deep learning happens. So think of these checkpoints as a formative assessment. And when you think of it as being formative, think of it as you're learning something where you might need to take a U-turn. You're actually slowing yourself down to understand at each part of the lab process what these student teams are not only coming up with, but how they understand your expectations. And also for students, it's slowing them down, helping them understand your expectations, and also understand what they themselves are communicating with you. So as students mature through this process, there's some kind of key things to look for. So at stage 1, students are ready to transition to stage 2 when they become comfortable interacting with ideas and depersonalizing feedback. And teachers are ready to move on to stage 2 when they have learned how to catch and toss ideas. Okay. And those ideas are students' ideas. At stage 2, things have matured when students become comfortable with taking personal risks and having that sort of team accountability. So they're going through these checkpoints with their partner and they're taking risks. They're not just sort of playing it safe, kind of hiding and saying, you know, oh, that's what my partner said. I don't know. He came up with it. Like, that's not acceptable, right? Or, you know, just sort of shutting down because it's like, you know, I can't do this, or this, you know, sort of trying to understand that team accountability element. For teachers at stage 2, they're basically ready to move on to stage 3 when they have learned to focus and listen on what the kids are saying when they come up to you. That may sound almost kind of condescending, and it's not intended that way, but slowing your mind and ears down to be able to focus in on what students are actually saying and not what you think they're saying is incredibly important. Okay, because it's not what you think they're saying that matters, it's what they're actually saying that matters, because that's what needs to be pressed and that's what needs to be potentially untangled and improved. Students need to develop the habit of really thinking deeply about what they say and about what they write. And so by you slowing down and focusing and listening and reflecting with them and probing and asking questions to develop an understanding, you're going to be developing that habit and that culture in your class. And that's incredibly important, because when it comes to a test, nobody is going to give students a pass based on what they think they meant. They're actually going to say, well, this is what you said. Just like their boss at work will say, well, this is what you said. Just like, you know, the interviewer at the job interview, just like the college admissions person, it's what you say that people hear and are listening for. And so if we're saying things that get interpreted or are heard by others, you know, not what we mean, we need to know that, and we need to become mindful of it so that we can improve before we get to a checkpoint, right? And so that's going to come from the teacher focusing and listening, because the students need that mirror to be able to develop the skill themselves, okay? At stage 3, you're going to see students beginning to produce their best work quickly because they want to make use of feedback and proceed to the next checkpoint, okay? They're going to see this as, oh, I can control my destiny. I don't need to wait for other people. I can achieve this and move on. That's huge, okay? For teachers, it's learning to refine this interaction and make it the most impactful when kids come up to you for a checkpoint, okay? What I mean by refining the interaction for impact is, 1, keeping it brief, okay? A minute or 2 minutes. How do you get through that ladder of feedback so quickly? That's a refinement skill-wise for teachers. The other thing is what do you focus on? The goal is not to focus on every piece of minutia and overwhelm kids and they shut down and so on. The point of the interaction is to focus on a correction area that's appropriate at that time. So at some time it may be being creative because we've learned to be focused and we understand the expectation of the particular stage of lesson planning and so on. And so now you're going to push students for creativity to be a more diverse thinker in the class because other people have already talked about this. And I'd like to see you push the envelope, John and Sally. I want you to think about something a little more creative because I know you can do it. That's one type of refinement and impact. Another level would be, if a student doesn't understand what a hypothesis is, then understanding as a teacher that this interaction needs to focus on one, helping that student understand what a hypothesis is, and two, helping them to form what they've created into a hypothesis, okay? And you turning them to make sure that that happens, giving them a time budget and so on. So that's all refinements in teacher practices, okay? Finally, stage 4 is all about, and you're at stage 4 when students are using checkpoints as a tool for progress and performance. It's like, this is just how we do it. And I know, I'm going to do these things and I'm going to meet these expectations and I'm going to take these risks. And that's how I perform well in Mr. Vigent's class. Okay. And that's going to get me to progress to this hands-on part and conclusion. And it's what we all do. And as a teacher, it's going to put me in the situation of being able to be a mentor and really reflective practitioner. Okay. I'm going to be mentoring and differentiating with all my students as they're coming through these checkpoints, but I'm also reflecting on my practices and it's helping me be a better teacher. One thing you might notice too is at different points in time and as things mature that, by Thanksgiving, typically in a school year, you are going to want to be bringing in these formative assessment techniques. Okay, and these formative assessment techniques are also found online under the supporting resources section. Okay, and it'll say support for formative assessment. And these techniques you might find replacing the ladder of feedback or just changing what it looks like, because some of these techniques can not only be helpful for getting students to think and to probe their thinking, but they can also sometimes be faster. So it's good to develop habits with the ladder of feedback, but these can also be kind of down the road hacks once everybody's on the same page. And again, this is something that I would use, you could use it in stage 1 towards the end of the whole group as you're kind of maybe more focus on what an individual student is saying and sort of interacting with that in front of the whole group. Or you might use this as a way of like making the ladder of feedback less formal after students have kind of gotten some structured feedback for a couple of different lessons. By the way, when I'm saying lessons, I'm talking about that whole lesson, like lesson 1 in unit 3, lesson 2 in unit 4. I don't mean just one day. You wouldn't do this like, whole group on day 1 and then teams on day 2 and, something else on day 3. That's not what I mean. I'm talking about in a different experience later on. Okay, so checkpoints I mentioned earlier are built into labs at key points. And so we're actually showing you when there's that release of responsibility, think about, where do I want to have checkpoints? Well, what would happen in that checkpoint? What would I be looking for? We've already helped structure that for you, and we've helped structure it for you and provided you the support of these formative assessment technique. So the two can go hand in hand. All right. And the reason that they're, checkpoint 1 is here and checkpoint 2 is here is that there's some teacher to teacher talk up here so that you can get a sense of what you might expect students are doing for summaries of experiments and directions that you may want to probe with questions if you start to understand students going, in one direction or another. Now, you can pause the video here if you're doing this on your own or with a group, and I would ask you to log into the NOADM Interactive, go to supporting resources, and locate the lab planning checkpoint helper, okay? And then what that checkpoint helper is going to look like is what you see here, and analyze the checkpoints, okay? If you're doing this as a group, there are 5 different checkpoints that are noted. Break up into 5 teams and each team take 1. If you're doing this on your own, start with the first checkpoint and ask yourselves these 2 questions. What will this interaction help you understand about your student? And what will your student learn more about at this checkpoint? And when you see a checkpoint, the checkpoint always is about what just happened here, because the students are just completed something and they're coming to the checkpoint, just like a border crossing, to show their papers, to talk about what they're here for, what they've done. And if they meet the expectations and it can explain it, then they get to proceed to the next part of planning. And that's the key here. And what I'm talking about now is more of stage 2 and beyond, okay, if students are acting in teams. As you're looking on your own or with groups, some of the things that are going to come up with, you're going to be noticing, I hope, is planning support. Like, how long should this take? Is being noted here for you. It's highlighting the formative assessment opportunities in there. And you're going to notice there are guiding supports for your role as the teacher and your student's role. But the difference between checkpoint 1 and checkpoint 2 is what you're looking for, okay? You're at checkpoint 1 looking for question, research, hypothesis. And it's not that, and I want to be careful using the word look for. I really, when I did this in my own class with my students, and literally, I mean, I have done this literally thousands of times. I always preferred to have students read their question, research, and hypothesis. And because they were partners at stage 2 and beyond, their question, research, and hypothesis should match, because lab partners need to have things matching. Okay, different teams can have different research and hypothesis, but same team partners cannot. So I would take one, and then I'd let the other student read it, and then I would be following along, because that would give me space to notice things and to formulate a probing question or clarifying question, okay? If students got a U-turn, they had to go back and make changes, they would come back to that same checkpoint and we'd interact again. And if they, fixed up whatever they needed to fix up, they could move on. And I would tell them, okay, you can move on to, let's say, a summary of the experiment, and I'm going to give you, 8 minutes to do that. Go. I want to see you back up here in 8 minutes or less. And so that would give them the next place to go. And so when they were done, they would come to checkpoint 2, where we would talk only about what's here. Now, sometimes other things come up, like, for example, if we're talking about summary of experiment and students are confused, I might ask them, well, what is the hypothesis that you're trying to test? So that's okay. But we're not going back and saying, well, we need to go change our hypothesis. We need to go change our research. We need to go change our question. Like, we're not getting into that. They shouldn't have passed checkpoint 1 if that needs to happen, okay? Now, if students recognize something and they really are committed that they want to go in a different direction, then of course, let them do it. But make them come and checkpoint again before they progress on to something later, okay? These checkpoints are super important opportunities to differentiate for individual students and teams, okay? This is a key way for you to essentially grade, but formatively assess where students are at and to meet their needs, okay? It sets up a collaborative learning environment as well, which is super important. And it also helps accelerate learning because of the way that we compare students, that every student in that team has equal opportunity to contribute, but also equal responsibility to be able to discuss and to think about things. And that's important for them to understand, okay? So remember, our role as teachers are, in this situation with checkpoints, is to be a reflective thought partner, to ask clarifying questions, to ask probing questions, to sometimes U-turn teams. And when I say sometimes, it's frequent. You know, that happens a lot. It's not like a once a day that happens, okay? But, you know, helping students through this process. But our role as a teacher is not to give students the ideas, okay? Sometimes when it comes to differentiating, we may help students engage in developing ideas by sharing maybe other things that we have heard teams share as a way to sort of spark their thinking, but that's different than telling them this is what you need to write, okay? So just summarizing that there are basically 5 checkpoints. And when you look at those checkpoints, they're happening at specific locations when students are in teams of 2 or 3 for a purpose, okay? And the purpose is to keep the checkpoint short, to keep it focused, to keep it useful. If you're on your own or if you're with a group, just reflect on these questions. You know, what makes you nervous about this? What makes you nervous about, you know, the planning process itself and releasing responsibility? For myself, you know, what my thing was always, I was worried about spending too much time with groups, because if you spend too much time at that stage 2 or 3 or 4 with groups, you can, you know, have students that are waiting on you. And some of the ways that I solved that was to involve students that were waiting in the discussion with the group that was actually at the checkpoint, because there were things that they might be able to pick up and change while they were waiting to get to their checkpoint, and it would help them out. And it also sort of involved them in the thinking and helped to communicate that we were sort of all at the same level here. But the other thing is that I was able to spend less time with groups by being really focused, okay? And I didn't, if there was something glaring students needed to correct, and then there was also like, you know, some other squirrely stuff, I always let them, I would U-turn them with the glaring thing to correct first, let them come back. And then if there was still some issue, we could talk about it and they might get a second U-turn, okay? But you know, after 2 U-turns, usually things were fine. And if they weren't, it meant that either I wasn't being clear enough or the students were, you know, there was something that they didn't understand that we needed to have a discussion about, okay? Ask yourself, you know, not only what makes you nervous, but what are some steps you can take to bring you and the students closer to that independence, to them working in the teams of 2 to plan those labs, okay? And always feel free to reach out to me. I am happy and love to hear about your success. I'm also happy to be a thought partner in the process. One other tool for inspiration as you're thinking about ways of probing and pushing students is maybe to take a look at the instructional lesson frames. These instructional lesson frames are also available under that supporting resources section, and they were developed during COVID for remote instruction. But what's interesting is that they were written for remote instruction to set parents up as a teacher's aide at home. So there are elements in the explanations that clue parents into what might be their role and how students should be engaging. And so by looking at some of these instructional lesson frames, you may get some inspiration for ways that you want to push students, probe, question, and what your expectations would be at different stages in that planning process. Okay, and so you'll notice when you click on the instructional lesson frames that you'll get a document, and there will be a zip file with all of the frames, both in English and in Spanish. There's also an easy to view tool, which is links directly to those frames by segment of the lesson. And those templates are something you can view. And if you use Seesaw and you find yourself in a remote or hybrid setting, you can use them through Google Classroom, which Seesaw plugs into. The other thing you could do is you could also rewrite them as prompts if you wanted to use them in class. But the way that they're written is for asynchronous learning environments at this point. Wonderful. So I appreciate all your time. I hope you enjoyed the videos. I hope you got some new ideas about how you want to engage your students in planning so that it's authentic, so that you're creating those opportunities for mastery, for identity, and for creativity. And so that students are actually finding meaning and learning from the materials that you're using, and they're not just doing things with them. So moving forward, I'd encourage you to locate your next activity, your lab, decide how you're going to incorporate checkpoints for student planning, okay? Where are you going to put them? Are you going to follow the way they are in the teacher's guide? Are you going to put them everywhere? Are you going to do this whole group? What's that going to be like, okay? Next, I want you to think about, make some decisions about how you're going to interact with your students thinking at those checkpoints. What's going to be your focus? What do you really care about? What are you going to be willing to let go? What are U-turns going to look like? Just think about it, kind of meditate on that. It doesn't mean that you're going to have a checklist and you're going to be super rigid with this, but you want to start anticipating, what does it mean to ask a question that is clarifying? Or what does it mean to ask a question that is probing? Because the questions that you ask are not, if you ask questions to transfer what's in your mind to the student's mind, that's not going to be too effective for the learning. What you want to do is ask questions to get what's in their mind out and to help them hear it and think about it as you're thinking about it, okay? And my challenge to you would be to try that generate, sort, connect activity if you are still acting whole group and planning, and try to transition to teams after a couple of lessons where, or a unit where you have done things more whole group. Try to transfer to teams at that stage too, where the teams can come for checkpoints and you use that ladder of feedback. And even feel free to show that ladder of feedback video to your students so they understand how that gets used, okay? If you have any questions, please feel free to, as always, to reach out to me. If you're looking for more resources, you have questions, and even feedback, I welcome it, I appreciate it. And whether it's positive or negative, I'm here to help support you in building on those successes or overcoming those challenges. So thank you for your time. I appreciate it, and good luck.